Somerset, September 1811. The letter had arrived on a Thursday, which was the day Lady Pemberton preferred for correspondence, having long ago decided that Thursdays carried the correct weight for matters requiring both discretion and consequence. It was addressed to Edmund Coraith, shipping merchant of Bristol, widower, father of one, and a man whose fortune had been built on timber contracts and the quiet, relentless competence of a person who understood that the sea did not care about your pedigree. The letter said, in the careful hand of a woman who had spent 38 years managing the social architecture of Somerset with the precision of an engineer, that the Duke of Ashworth required a wife, that the Coraith fortune was of the appropriate scale, that the Coraith daughter was, by all accounts, accomplished and sensible, and that Lady Pemberton had taken the liberty of arranging an introduction at Ashworth Hall on the 14th of September at 11 in the morning, which was the hour she considered optimal for conversations that might determine the course of several lives. She had not, it must be noted, asked Edmund Coraith whether his daughter wished to be introduced. She had not asked the Duke of Ashworth whether he wished to receive her. Lady Pemberton operated on the principle that asking people what they wanted introduced an unnecessary variable into proceedings that were already complex enough, and that most people, when presented with a well-constructed arrangement, would recognize its merit and comply. Cressida Coraith read the letter at the breakfast table on the Friday morning because her father had placed it beside her plate without comment, which was his way of saying that the contents required her attention and that he had already formed a view he was not going to share until she had formed hers. She read it twice, set it down beside the toast rack, and looked at her father across the table. "A duke," she said. "A duke," he confirmed. He did not look up from his own correspondence, which concerned a timber shipment from the Baltic that was occupying approximately 1/5 of his attention, the remaining 4/5 being directed at his daughter in the way that 24 years of close observation had made instinctive. And Lady Pemberton has arranged this without consulting either party. Lady Pemberton, her father said, turning a page, has been arranging things without consulting the relevant parties since before you were born. It is, I believe, her primary talent. Cressida considered the letter again. She thought about what she knew of the Duke of Ashworth, which was considerable, because Cressida Coraith made it her practice to know things, and because Somerset society talked about the Duke of Ashworth the way coastal towns talked about the weather, constantly and with the understanding that conditions could change without warning. She knew that he was 31. She knew that he had inherited the dukedom at 23 upon his father's death, and had managed the Ashworth estate with a competence that even his critics acknowledged. She knew that he had been married once to Lady Viola Stratham, daughter of the Earl of Dunmore, and that the marriage had ended in a scandal Somerset discussed in the specific hushed tones reserved for events that were both deeply felt and thoroughly enjoyed. She knew that Lady Viola had left Ashworth Hall under circumstances the county had never fully clarified, and that the Duke had emerged from the experience with a reputation for coldness that Cressida suspected was not coldness at all, but the particular stillness of a man who had learned to keep the weight of things off his face. She knew one more thing. The Ashworth Estate's western holdings, 300 acres of prime Somerset farmland that included the most productive orchards in the county, sat on land that had once belonged to Cressida's mother's family, the Montforts. The land had been sold to the Ashworth estate 40 years ago under terms that Cressida's grandfather had considered fair, and that Cressida's mother, before her death, had considered the single greatest financial error the Montfort family had ever made. Her mother had left her a letter about it, sealed, undated, with instructions written on the envelope in her mother's careful hand. "When the time is right, you will know." Cressida had carried that letter for 3 years, since her mother's death, tucked into the writing case she brought everywhere, and she had not opened it, because she had not yet encountered a moment that felt like the one her mother had anticipated. "I will go," she said. Her father turned another page of the Baltic correspondence. "Because Lady Pemberton expects it?" "Because I am curious," she said. "And because a duke who needs a fortune is a duke whose position is more complicated than it appears, and I find complicated positions interesting." Her father regarded her over the top of the shipping letter. "Be careful with interesting," he said. "Interesting has costs." "So does boredom," she said, and picked up the toast. They arrived at Ashworth Hall on the 14th at 10 minutes before 11, because Cressida believed in arriving early enough to read a house before its owner had the chance to present it. The hall was Georgian, symmetrical, and managed with the kind of precision that said its master either valued order or used order to control what lay beneath it. The staff who received them were efficient and unsmiling, which told her the household ran on competence rather than warmth. Lady Pemberton was already there. She materialized in the entrance hall with the practiced timing of a woman who understood that the first face a visitor saw determined the temperature of everything that followed. She was 62, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and dressed with the understated authority of a woman whose influence required no announcement. "Miss Corraith," she said. "And Mr. Corraith, how good of you to come." "How good of you to arrange it," Edmund said, with the mildness that was his version of irony. They were shown to the morning room. Cressida sat. She wore a dress of deep amber, well made, not fashionable in the London sense, but fashionable in the sense that mattered, which was that it fit her precisely and said nothing it did not mean. She had her mother's coloring, dark hair, pale skin, and the steady gaze of a woman who had learned early that looking away first was a concession she could not afford. The Duke of Ashworth entered at exactly 11. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of face that would have been handsome if it had been willing to participate in the effort. His gaze moved across the room with the efficiency of someone cataloging its contents and assigning them their appropriate weight. It reached Cressida and stopped, briefly, with the fractional pause of a man encountering something he had not accounted for in his preparations. "Miss Corraith," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He sat across from her. "I will not waste your time," he said. "Lady Pemberton has no doubt explained the general nature of this meeting." "She has explained that you require a wife," Cressida said. "She has not explained why." Something moved behind his expression, the reaction of a man who had expected compliance and received a question instead. "The reasons are practical," he said. "The estate requires an alliance of a certain financial character. I require a wife who understands the responsibilities of the position and who will conduct herself with discretion and reliability." He paused. "My previous marriage ended badly. I will not discuss the details. What I will say is that I learned from it the value of clarity in expectations. I do not want a companion. I do not want a partner in the romantic sense. I want an arrangement that is transparent, functional, and free of the complications that arise when sentiment is allowed to interfere with practicality." Cressida studied him, the set of his jaw, the way his hands rested on the arms of the chair, with a stillness that was not relaxation, but restraint. The way he had said the word sentiment, as though it were a substance he had been exposed to once and had developed a permanent sensitivity to. She understood, with the clarity she brought to negotiations and numbers and the structure of a person's silences, that he was not describing what he wanted. He was describing what he was afraid of. And the architecture of his fear had the precise dimensions of a woman who had hurt him in ways he had organized into policy and was now presenting as preference. "You are asking me to audition for a role," she said, "in which the primary qualification is the absence of feeling. I am asking you to consider an arrangement in which expectations are clear and surprises are few. She thought about the letter in her writing case, the sealed one, her mother's hand on the envelope. She thought about what it meant to sit across from a man who had taken a wound and built a fortress out of the scar tissue and was now interviewing candidates to live inside the fortress under carefully controlled conditions. "And if I do not meet the requirements of the role," she said, "if I prove to be a person rather than a function, what then?" Something in the quality of his stillness shifted, the way a structure shifts when weight is applied to a point it was not designed to bear. "Then you are free to go," he said. His voice was cold and level and carefully emptied of everything that might have made it human. There would be no obligation, no attachment, no consequence. You would simply be free to go. The room was quiet. Lady Pemberton at the window had gone very still. Edmund Carraith was watching his daughter with the calm of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen and was choosing not to intervene. Cressida looked at the Duke of Ashworth. She looked at his careful, controlled, defended face, and she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cold one. It was the smile of a woman who had just been told she was disposable by a man who did not realize he had revealed everything about himself in the act of saying it. A smile that said, "I have heard you completely, and I understand more than you intended, and I am not injured by this, because you are the one who does not yet understand what is happening in this room." She reached into her writing case. Not her mother's letter, not yet, but a document she had brought because Cressida Carraith did not walk into rooms without preparation. A surveyor's report, commissioned 6 months earlier, detailing the western boundary of the Ashworth estate and the historical claim of the Montford family to 300 acres of its most productive land. "Before I accept your generous offer of freedom," she said, with a composure that made his composure look like effort, "perhaps your grace would like to review this." She placed the document on the table between them. For the first time since he had entered the room, the managed facade faltered, not dramatically, but with the subtle recalibration of a man who had walked into a negotiation believing he held all the terms and had just discovered that the other party had arrived with terms of her own. She stood. "I will leave you to review the document at your leisure," she said. "When you have considered its implications, you may write to me." She paused. "Or not. As you said, Your Grace, there is no obligation." She inclined her head. Not a curtsy, a nod, the kind given between equals, or between a woman who knew her worth and a man who had not yet calculated it correctly. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning, Miss Corrith," he said. But his voice had lost the cold and had not yet found what would replace it. She collected her father, and they were in the carriage and through the Ashworth gates before Lady Pemberton had fully registered that the interview she had spent 3 weeks arranging had lasted 18 minutes and had not produced the outcome she had designed. In the carriage, Edmund was quiet for the first 2 miles. "The surveyor's report," he said. "A precaution," she said. "You showed your hand early." "I showed him 1 card," she said. "He does not know what else is in the case." Her father glanced at the writing case on the seat beside her, where her mother's unopened letter sat beneath the correspondence and the Bristol accounts. "Your mother's letter," he said. "Not yet," she said. "When?" She looked out the window at the Somerset Hills in their September colors. "When the time is right," she said, and heard her mother's handwriting in her own voice, and almost smiled. The Duke spent the remainder of the 14th in his study. The surveyor's report was on his desk. He had read it 3 times. His steward, Mr. Garrick, had provided the estate records with the efficient neutrality of a man who had learned that the most useful quality in a steward was the ability to deliver information without opinion. "The Montford claim, Your Grace," Mr. Garrick said. "It predates the 1771 purchase. The original Montford grant was issued in 1732 under terms that included a reversionary clause. If the land was sold outside the Montford line, the clause permitted any direct descendant to petition for reassessment within 3 generations. The 3rd generation would be Miss Coraith. Her mother was the last Montford by birth. The Duke sat with this. He sat with the surveyor's report and the image of a woman in an amber dress who had smiled at him in a way he had not been smiled at in 3 years, and had placed a document on his table with the composure of a person laying down a card in a game she had been preparing for longer than he had known they were playing. He thought about Lady Viola, the forged documents, the solicitor's bills, the 18 months of proceedings that had cost him 1/3 of his sleep and nearly 1/3 of his estate. And then he thought about a woman with dark hair and steady eyes who had asked him why he needed a wife, and had listened to his answer with the attention of a person who was hearing what he wasn't saying as clearly as what he was. "Write to Miss Coraith's solicitor," he said. "Request a meeting regarding the reversionary clause." "Shall I draft the letter, Your Grace?" "No. I will write it myself." The letter took him 4 drafts, which was 3 more than any letter had taken him in recent memory. His letter arrived on a Monday. It was written in his own hand, precise, angular, unhurried. It proposed a meeting at Ashworth Hall on Thursday, next at 2 in the afternoon, and made no reference to the interview, to the morning room, to the words, "free to go." The omission, Cressida decided, was more eloquent than any reference would have been. She wrote back the same afternoon. "Thursday at 2 is acceptable. I will bring my father's solicitor and the Montford records. C. Coraith." They were shown to the study, not the morning room. She noted this. The morning room was for social performances. The study was where he worked. She was being admitted to the operational center of the estate. The study was lined with maps, estate maps, county maps, geological surveys, drainage plans. They covered the walls with the density of a man who understood his land, not as an inheritance, but as a system. She filed this alongside the broken spines of books she had noticed previously, and the unhurried precision of his handwriting. A man who did not decorate and did not hide. The meeting lasted 3 hours. She had expected competence from the Duke. She had not expected precision. He knew the 1732 records intimately, not as a man who had reviewed them for this occasion, but as someone who knew his estate's history by long occupation and continuous attention. He identified the 3 points where the Montford claim was strongest and the 2 where it was most vulnerable, and laid them out with a directness that surprised her solicitor, Mr. Calloway, who was accustomed to landowners who left the details to their legal representatives. "The reversionary clause," the Duke said, "permits a petition for reassessment. It doesn't guarantee a favorable outcome. The clause requires direct lineage and material interest in the land." "Direct lineage is established," Cressida said. "My mother was the last Montford by birth." "Material interest requires more than a historical claim," he replied. "It requires a demonstrable connection, current use, current investment, current presence." "Then I shall have to establish a current interest," she said. "There is a property adjacent to the Western holdings, Thornfield Manor. It has been on the market since July. The house is sound, the land is productive, and the location would establish the material connection the clause requires." The Duke was quiet. Mr. Garrick at the window turned his head slightly. "Thornfield Manor borders the Ashworth Western holdings on 3 sides, the Duke said. "It does," she said. "The location is extremely convenient." The smile she had given him in the morning room was not on her face, but it was in the room. He could feel it. She could feel him feeling it. "Convenient," he repeated. For the purposes of the clause, she said. Purely a legal strategy. Mr. Prewitt, he said without looking away from her. Please note Miss Carraith's stated intention regarding Thornfield Manor. She left Ashworth Hall at 5:30. In the carriage, Mr. Calloway reviewed his notes with the satisfaction of a solicitor who had witnessed excellent preparation meet excellent opposition. The Duke is not what I expected, he said. He knows the records better than most landowners know their own tenants. That will make this more difficult, Cressida said, and meant two things at once, and acknowledged neither. Thornfield Manor was purchased on the 29th of September. The price was fair, the property sound, a handsome stone manor with 80 acres of productive land, positioned precisely where she needed it, close enough to the Ashworth Western holdings that her presence would be impossible to overlook, and far enough from Ashworth Hall itself that the proximity could be credibly described as coincidental. Her father asked whether she had reviewed the drainage survey, which she had, and whether she understood that buying a property adjacent to a duke's estate in the middle of a legal dispute would be interpreted by the county in exactly one way, regardless of how many legal justifications she attached to it. I am comfortable with the strategy, she said. The interpretation is the county's concern. Your mother, he said, and stopped. He did not often mention her mother. When he did, it was with the careful brevity of a man who carried that loss in a private room and did not open the door frequently. Your mother would have done exactly this. She would have bought the property and called it strategy and believed it for approximately 1 week, and then she would have admitted that strategy was only part of the architecture. It is strategy, Cressida said. But she heard the almost in her own voice, and her father heard it too, and neither of them remarked on it. She was at Thornfield by the 2nd week of October. She arrived with 2 carriages of furniture from Bristol, a housekeeper named Mrs. Danworth, who considered inefficiency a personal insult, and a set of Montford family records that she installed in the library on the first afternoon with the care of a person establishing a headquarters. The land was productive, but underattended. The previous owner had let the orchards drift, the pruning schedules abandoned, the irrigation channels silted. She walked every acre in the first week with the methodical attention of a person, taking inventory of what she had bought and what it would cost to make it what she intended. She had a plan drawn up by Friday. By the following Monday, she had engaged a local estate manager named Holt, who arrived with cautious optimism and dropped the caution by the end of the first week. The Duke was informed of her arrival by Mr. Garrick, who mentioned it during the Tuesday estate review, with the carefully maintained fiction that it was routine. Miss Corraith has taken possession of Thornfield, Your Grace. She has engaged Holt. The irrigation channels are being cleared. She has also commissioned a survey of the orchard boundaries. Another survey, the Duke said. Mr. Garrick said nothing, which was the most eloquent response available to him. The estate review continued. The Duke did not look at the west-facing window again, but Mr. Garrick noted the effort it required. The county dinners began in November. They were at the same dinner twice. The first was at the Thurlow house, where Mrs. Thurlow, a widow of 47 with sharp opinions and warmth she deployed strategically, had seated them at opposite ends of the table. Cressida talked about the orchard restoration with Mr. Fenwick, a local landowner who knew fruit trees, and was aware throughout the conversation that the Duke was listening in the way she had learned to identify, the attention directed at her with a frequency that could not be accounted for by politeness or coincidence. The second dinner was at Ashworth Hall itself, 14 people. Cressida spent 40 minutes with Sir Aldous Cray discussing Somerset water rights, because Sir Aldous was the county's authority on the subject, and the Thornfield irrigation was going to require permissions she did not yet have. The Duke joined the conversation at the 20-minute mark with the seamless timing of a man who had been waiting for the right moment. The three of them talked about water rights and autumn rainfall, And then Sir Aldous was called away by his wife, and it was just the two of them, and the conversation moved without either of them steering it from water rights to orchards to a question he asked about her father's shipping operation. That was the first question he had asked her about anything other than land or law. She answered it. He listened with the unguarded attention she was beginning to recognize as his genuine mode, the one that emerged when he forgot to prevent it. He asked a second question. She thought this is what it sounds like when he is actually curious. She thought, I need to stop cataloging the qualities of his curiosity. At the end of the evening, Lady Pemberton appeared beside her in the entrance hall. My godson, she said, has not watched a woman the way he watches you since Viola. She paused, and he did not watch Viola with that quality. He watched Viola with caution. He watches you with something else entirely. Lady Pemberton, Cressida said, I purchased Thornfield as a legal strategy. Of course you did, Lady Pemberton said. And the orchards you are restoring at considerable personal expense, those are also legal strategy? The orchards establish material interest in the land, as required by the clause. Lady Pemberton smiled with the serenity of a woman who had heard the same explanation 3 times in the past month and had formed her own conclusions. Good evening, Miss Corrith. December brought frost, and the frost brought a problem. The irrigation channels froze and backed water into the lower orchard, threatening the spring crop. She wrote to the Duke on a Tuesday morning because the overflow was crossing onto Ashworth land, and she believed in disclosing problems before they became disputes. He arrived at Thornfield on Wednesday afternoon, in person, on foot. She was in the lower field with Holt when she saw him coming across the western boundary, and she walked to meet him at the property line without pretending she had been doing anything other than actual work. I thought a look at the damage would be more practical than correspondence, he said. They walked the grounds together in the December cold. She showed him where the ice had formed, where the water had backed, where the original design had failed. He asked 2 questions that confirmed he understood the problem, and one that surprised her. If the inlet were moved here, he said, pointing to the survey map, the gradient would clear the ice before it reached the root systems. That was Holt's conclusion, she said. The work will require access across the Ashworth boundary lane. I intended to send a formal request through Mr. Garrick, she said. Send it to me, he said. She studied him. His breath was visible in the December air, and his coat was practical rather than fashionable, and he was standing in her field in the cold because she had written about ice damage, and he had come himself. You came in person, she said. A steward would have sufficed. He held her gaze. You addressed your letter to me, he said. I took that to mean the matter warranted a direct response. It did. They walked back to the house. She offered tea. He accepted, which was the first time he had accepted anything at Thornfield. They sat in the library for 40 minutes and talked about irrigation, and then about the county road tax, and then about a book on orchard management she had on the shelf that he had also read, and neither of them mentioned the morning room or the words free to go, and the afternoon was something that resisted easy categorization, and that neither of them attempted to categorize. The winter months passed in the particular rhythm of a county that noticed everything and discussed most of it. January brought 2 more dinners, and a hard frost that tested the temporary repairs she had made to the irrigation channels. She spent the month in the Thornfield Library with Holt and the Montford records, mapping the full extent of the historical claim and building a file that grew thicker by the week. She also spent the month not thinking about the Duke of Ashworth, which required a degree of discipline she found instructive, because the effort itself told her something she was not yet willing to examine directly. February brought a letter from his solicitor proposing terms for the boundary access, which were generous and which Cressida accepted without negotiation, because the terms were fair and because negotiating them would have manufactured a dispute where none existed. She received a second letter that month, not from the solicitor, but from the Duke himself, brief and direct, inquiring whether the temporary channel repairs had held through the January frost. She wrote back that they had, and that the permanent work would begin in March. His reply arrived the following day. It said, "Good." The one-word note should not have occupied as much of her attention as it did. She put it in the desk drawer with the other letters and returned to the Montfort records, and did not examine why she was keeping a file of correspondence from a man she was ostensibly in a legal dispute with. The spring assembly at the Thurlow House was the first large gathering of the new year. 50 people, the full county. Cressida arrived with Mrs. Thurlow and found the Duke across the room in conversation with Sir Aldous. He noticed her arrival with the attention she had stopped pretending not to recognize. The evening proceeded. She talked about spring planting with the Thurlows. She talked about the road tax with Sir Aldous and with the Duke, who joined the discussion and stayed. And the conversation moved from taxes to orchards to a question he asked about the Montfort family records she had been organizing at Thornfield. That was the first question he had asked about her family rather than her land. Viscount Hale arrived at her left shoulder. She had been tracking him for 20 minutes. Hale was 55, titled, prosperous in the inherited sense, rather than the earned sense, and possessed of the confidence of a man who had never been required to justify his position and considered this absence of scrutiny a reflection of merit. There were 5 people within easy hearing. He had positioned himself with care. "Thornfield is looking well, I am told," Hale said. "Quite the project you have undertaken." "Thank you," she said. "One does wonder about the permanence of these." He paused with the timing of a man who enjoyed his own pauses. "Enthusiasms. Somerset has a certain character, Miss Corraith, an established rhythm. New arrivals sometimes mistake energy for belonging. The word belonging did the work he had designed it to do. In another context, it was neutral. In his mouth, with his audience and his carefully arranged smile, it meant you are a merchant's daughter in a room full of titles, and the orchards and the surveys and the legal claims do not change the fundamental arithmetic of what you are." Cressida held his gaze. She had heard this frequency of condescension in Bristol, shipping offices, and London drawing rooms, and across negotiating tables, where men with less competence and more pedigree had attempted to reduce her to a category they found manageable. She was formulating her response when she heard the Duke's voice, not the voice from the morning room, not the voice from the study or the dinners, the one beneath all of them, the one that carried 200 years of Somerset in it and understood exactly what weight it held. "The work at Thornfield," the Duke said from her right, "has resolved a water failure affecting both the Thornfield and Ashworth properties for over 20 years. Every landholder in the Western District has benefited." His gaze held Hale's for 1 beat longer than social convention required. "I believe we all value landowners who take their responsibilities seriously." Hale's smile underwent a rapid adjustment. "Of course, Your Grace, I merely—" "The county," the Duke said with the economy of a man who did not require volume to be heard, "has room for competence. I believe we are agreed on that." Hale found someone else to talk to with the haste of a man who had been publicly corrected and needed time to recover his footing. Cressida stood beside the Duke in the aftermath. He had not made her a cause. He had not made it personal. He had placed accurate information into a room receiving inaccurate impressions, and he had done it in a way that left Hale no path to continue and left her defended without being diminished. He returned to conversation with Sir Aldous as though nothing had occurred. She crossed to Lady Pemberton. "He intervened," Cressida said. "I saw," Lady Pemberton said. She accepted a glass of wine with the calm of a woman who had been anticipating this conversation for months. He made it about the land, so that Hale had no position to retreat to, so that the room understood the facts without requiring a declaration, and so that you were protected without being reduced. She paused, which is a very specific kind of intelligence. Cressida looked across the room at the Duke. He was not looking at her. "He was wrong about me," she said. "In the morning room." "Yes," Lady Pemberton said. "And he knows it. He has known it for some time. He does his accounting carefully. He required sufficient evidence." Cressida found the Duke's gaze across the room, not the controlled attention. The other one, she held it for one beat longer than convention required, and then turned back to Lady Pemberton and said something about the road tax, and the assembly continued around them, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. He came to Thornfield on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the assembly. She was in the lower field reviewing the planting schedule with Holt. She saw him at the gate on foot and walked to meet him without hurrying. He did not appear to expect her to. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Coraith." He looked at the irrigation channels running clear in the March morning. "It is working." "It is working," she confirmed. "The lower field at Ashworth was dry this morning for the first time in 4 winters, he said. He looked at her. He looked at the gate between them, which she had not opened. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "In the morning room," he said. "In September." What I said. Free to go, as though you were an applicant who had failed to meet a specification. As though the terms were mine to set, and the only question was whether you would comply with them. He was looking at the gatepost, which was the only indication that this was costing him something. "I came to that meeting with a position formed before I entered the room," he said. "A position that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with your first wife," she said. "I understood in the morning room," she said. "That is why I smiled. Not because you insulted me, though you did, but because I understood that you were not seeing me. You were managing a history. You were building a wall with the dimensions of the damage she had done, and you were interviewing women to stand on the other side of it and call it a marriage." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I am not Viola," she said. "I am not a correction for what Viola did. I am not a woman who forges documents or deceives or dismantles things from the inside. But I am also not a woman who will accept being auditioned for trustworthiness as though trust is something I should be grateful to receive rather than something I have already earned." The face before her had nothing managed in it, nothing controlled. It was the face of a man who had spent 3 years building a structure out of his own damage, and was hearing it described with a precision he had not been able to achieve himself. "I know," he said. "I have known it since December." "You are not a safer version of anything," he said. "You are the most inconvenient development in the entire history of managing this estate. And I mean that as a full accounting of my situation. You defended me at the assembly," she said. "Hale was." "You defended me," she said, before Hale finished his sentence. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was wrong," he said, "and I was the person in that room most obligated to say so, given that I had been wrong about the same things in September and had taken considerably longer to recognize it." He paused. "And because you had already made the case better than anyone in that room could have, I wanted that on the record." She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The grounds are worth seeing properly, and I believe I owe you tea." He came through the gate. He fell into step beside her on the path toward the house. The March morning was clear, and the channels were running clean, and nothing had been said that resolved everything, and everything had been said that needed saying first. The tea was in the Thornfield library. She had chosen the library because it was where she worked, and because she was not going to arrange a drawing room for him, as though this were a social call, It wasn't a social call. It was a man who had come through a gate she had opened. Mrs. Danworth brought the tea and left. Cressida poured and sat back in her chair. He looked at the books, the desk covered in estate plans and orchard surveys and Montford records, and a letter from her father's Bristol solicitor. He looked at all of it with the attention of a man reading a room and understanding what it said about the person who lived in it. "You work here," he said, "every morning. The drawing room is for callers," she said. "The library is for work." She paused. "You are not a caller." He drank his tea. She felt the weight of what she had just said and did not retract it. "I want to say something about the morning room," she said. He waited. "I understood what you were doing," she said. "I understood it the moment you said it, that you were not describing me. You were describing what you needed after what you had been through." I did not smile because I was amused. I smiled because I understood that arguing with you would have required you to defend a position you held for reasons neither of us were ready to discuss. The smile was the only honest response. He was quiet. "It was the most disorienting thing anyone has done in my presence in 3 years," he said. "I thought about it for a week." "What did you conclude?" "That I had managed the interview very badly," he said, "and that you had managed it exceptionally well, and that the woman who smiled like that was not a woman who would simply be free to go. She was a woman who would go exactly when and where and how she chose, and the freedom was hers regardless of whether I offered it." He paused. That was not the quality I had advertised for. "No," she said. "It was a better one." "Soren," she said. He stilled. She had not used his name before. She had used his title, and Your Grace, and the space where his name would go. And now the name itself was in the Thornfield Library, and neither of them could take it back. "Yes," he said. "I bought this property because of you," she said. "Not entirely. The land is sound, and the legal strategy is real. But I bought it, knowing it bordered yours, and I told myself it was about the clause, and I almost believed it for approximately 2 weeks. I was angry," she said, "and I wanted you to see me. Not the fortune and the father and the category you had assigned me before I had said 10 words. I thought if I were your neighbor, if I were standing in your grounds quoting your own estate records back to you, you would have to see me eventually." "That was not a measured strategy," she said. "It was an effective one," he said. "It resulted in you being here, in this library, having this conversation." He paused. "I consider the investment sound." He stood. He came around the desk and stood before her chair, and she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting, and they were close in the library, with the March morning light coming through the south windows and the survey maps between them and 6 months of boundary disputes behind them. "I was wrong about you," he said. "In September, I was wrong before I met you, and wrong during the meeting, and I am asking." He stopped. "I am asking whether I am too late." She reached into her writing case. She removed the envelope, her mother's letter, the one she had carried for 3 years with the instruction written on the outside. "When the time is right, you will know." She opened it. He watched her read it. She read it once, quickly. She read it again, slowly. Her eyes changed, not dramatically. The way light changes when a cloud moves, the same landscape seen differently. The letter contained 2 things. The first was a deed, not to the 300 acres, but to something smaller and older. A deed to the original Montford cottage at the center of the disputed Western holdings. A cottage excluded from the 1771 sale by a clause so minor that no surveyor in 79 years had noticed it. A cottage that still belonged, by unbroken legal title, to the Montford line, to Cressida. The second thing was a message. I kept this from everyone, including your father, because I wanted you to have it when you were ready, not when it was convenient. The cottage is yours. The land around it will follow, or it will not. But the cottage gives you standing. Use it when you find the person worth standing next to. I trust your judgment. I always have. With love that does not require an envelope, your mother. Cressida looked up from the letter. She held the deed and her mother's last act of faith in her judgment, and she said, "You are not too late." He took her hand. The one holding the letter. He held it with the deliberate grip of a man who understood that what he was holding was not just a hand, but a decision and a history and the accumulated weight of 6 months of evidence that had dismantled every position he had built. He kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It had the honesty of a man who had been revising his conclusions for 6 months and had arrived at one he was prepared to act on. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and every true thing she had ever decided. And the library was warm, and the March morning was outside, and the letter was still in her hand, and none of it required any further management. When they separated, she kept her hand in his. "The cottage deed changes the legal position," she said. "My solicitor will need to review the implications." "Are we conducting a legal review?" he said. "Or are we establishing that you have just kissed me and immediately returned to property law?" The corner of her mouth did the thing it did when she was preventing a smile, which he had noticed many times and was now permitted to acknowledge. "I am establishing that the practical matters are in order, before addressing the impractical ones," she said. "And are they in order?" "They are entirely in order," she said. "You are going to be very difficult to live with," he said. "Is that an observation or a complaint?" "It is a preliminary finding," he said, "subject to further evidence. I find preliminary findings useful before major commitments," she said. He took her hand. Cressida. Her name, the specific, irreplaceable sound of it. "Soren," she said, and this time it meant everything she had not said since September. They were engaged by the 2nd week of April. He asked in the Thornfield Library on a Wednesday morning, and she said yes, and they regarded each other for a moment with the slightly bewildered formality of two people who had arrived at tenderness through property law and were not entirely sure of the protocol. He took her hand across the desk, and she let him hold it, and the March survey maps were still spread beneath their joined hands, and she thought that no one in the history of Somerset had ever become engaged on top of a boundary dispute, and that this was, in its way, the most honest foundation a marriage could have. Her father received the news from behind the Bristol shipping accounts. "The Duke of Ashworth," he said. "The man who told you that you were free to go." "He has revised that position," she said. "He came to my gate and apologized without a single qualifying clause," she said, "and sat in my library and drank my tea, and said the smile was the most disorienting thing he had encountered in 3 years. She paused. "I find I cannot hold a man's September against him when his March is everything it ought to be." Her father set down the accounts. "Is he worthy of you?" "He is trying to be," she said. "That is the best answer available." Her father nodded. "It is the best answer," he agreed. He picked up the accounts, put them down again, and looked at her, with the attention of a man who had been watching this particular person for 24 years and had never once underestimated what he saw. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. "She would have argued with him constantly, and she would have liked him." Cressida held this. She held it carefully, because her father did not say things like this often, and when he did, they carried the weight of a door being opened into a room he usually kept closed. "I think she anticipated something like this," Cressida said. "The letter. The timing instruction on the envelope. She knew I would need it when I found someone worth the argument," Her father was quiet for a moment. "She usually did know," he said. The Duke's letter after the engagement, addressed to Cressida and not to her father, said, "Your father's letter was generous and entirely beside the point. I am marrying you. The accounts will follow. S." She put it in the desk drawer where she kept his letters. There were 9 now. She returned to the spring planting schedule with the focused attention of a woman who was extremely pleased and not going to be impractical about it. Lady Pemberton called on Tuesday with the energy of a woman who had been exercising restraint for 4 days, which was her absolute maximum. She sat in the library chair across from Cressida's desk and accepted tea with the composure of a woman settling in for a thorough accounting. "The library," she said. Again. "It is where I work," Cressida said. "It is where you do everything, apparently," Lady Pemberton said, "including, I am given to understand, conducting the most consequential conversation of my godson's adult life." She set down her cup. "He was happy when he called on me yesterday. I have not seen him happy in 3 years. He showed it the way he shows everything, quietly and without announcement. But it was unmistakable." She studied Cressida steadily. "You are good for him." "He is good for me," Cressida said, "which is the thing I did not expect. I expected to prove a point. I expected to be right." She paused. "I did not expect to discover that he was also right about certain things, and that those things were what made him worth the argument." "What was he right about?" "That a woman who understands her own value," Cressida said, "is a formidable thing. He had entirely the wrong language for it. But the instinct beneath the language was not wrong." Lady Pemberton regarded her for a moment. "He is going to discover," she said, "that he has acquired a duchess who will manage his estate more effectively than he does." "He has already discovered it," Cressida said. "He mentioned it at least twice during the proposal." Lady Pemberton stood. "The engagement dinner," she said. "I will host it. Hale will be invited." She paused at the door. "Because it is better to have him at the table, where he must behave, than outside it, where he will not. And because watching Viscount Hale congratulate you on your engagement to the Duke of Ashworth will be among the more satisfying things I have witnessed in recent memory." Cressida considered this. "I find I am not above enjoying that either," she said. They were married in June at the church in the village between the Ashworth and Thornfield estates. She wore the deep amber again. No one was surprised. She walked in on her father's arm and thought about the morning room in September and the smile she had given the Duke on her way out of his life. She thought about all the versions of the smile. "The first, in the morning room, I understand more than you intended, and I am choosing to leave. The second, across the assembly after Hale, a private acknowledgement that said, 'I see what you did.' The third, in the library the day he came through the gate, when she had not smiled at all, the deliberate absence, which said, 'I am no longer performing for you.' She had thought about the fourth version. She had decided sometime in April that it would not be a smile at all. She reached the front of the church. Soren stood there with nothing of September in his face, nothing of the morning room, nothing of the man who had organized his grief into a policy. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had bought the estate next door and argued the boundary and fixed the water system and been right about everything and had chosen him anyway. She did not smile. She took his hand. She placed her mother's letter in his palm, the opened one, the one that said, "Use it when you find the person worth standing next to." He closed his hand around both, the letter and her hand together, with the grip of a man who meant what he agreed to and did not intend to let go. At the wedding breakfast, Hale congratulated them with the grace of a man who had exhausted his alternatives and was conducting himself accordingly. Mrs. Thurlow watched this exchange from across the room and caught Cressida's eye and raised her glass an inch, which was the Somerset equivalent of a standing ovation. Her father found her at the edge of the room in the late afternoon, when the breakfast was moving toward its close. He stood beside her and looked at the room, at the county assembled and performing itself for its own benefit, at the June light coming through the tall windows. "He is happy," she said. "Are you?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I am," she said. "I am also still annoyed about 2 things he said in December, and I intend to revisit them at the appropriate time." "Only 2 things," her father said. "The third resolved itself in February. He conceded the point about the Southfield rotation in writing, which I have filed." Her father laughed, the full, genuine laugh of a man who had spent 24 years being proud of this person and had decided today was the correct occasion to let it show. "You are going to be a magnificent duchess," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to be." Soren found her in the West Garden as the June evening light moved across the Somerset countryside in the long, golden way of evenings that did not want to end. She was looking at the orchards, his or hers or theirs, the distinction no longer carrying the weight it had in September. "All of it," he said. "The orchards and the Western holdings, and the boundary, and the cottage, and the library. All of it is yours. In every sense that matters. I want you to know it, I know that." She looked at the trees in the June light and thought about freedom, and what it had meant in September when he had offered it as a dismissal, and what it meant now when she understood that the truest freedom was not being free to go but being free to stay, on terms she had written herself, beside a man who had learned to read them. "Soren," she said. "Yes. I am going to reorganize the Ashworth Library. The cataloging system has no logical basis." He regarded her with an expression that was attempting to suppress a smile and not entirely succeeding. "The library is yours," he said. She stepped toward him. He met her in the middle of the West Garden, between the orchard rows and the long June light, and the Ashworth chimneys behind them, and the Thornfield chimneys visible in the other direction. 2 estates on either side of a boundary they had disputed and agreed on, and were now in every sense beyond. She smiled, not the morning room smile, not the assembly acknowledgement, not the deliberate absence. This was the 4th smile, the one she had been saving since April. Full, unguarded, completely real. The kind that required no management and no strategy and no precision. The kind that said everything the other 3 had been protecting. "I see you. I am not leaving. I am here." "Soren," she said, and his name in her voice had all of September and October, and every month since in it, and none of it was a wound anymore. "Cressida," he said. He took her hand. She let him take it. The June evening went on around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been practical. And the answer they had both concluded was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in September. The best investments, her father had always said, were the ones you understood better after you had made them than before. She understood this one completely. And in the writing case, she would carry into Ashworth Hall that evening, beside the Bristol accounts and the 9 letters and the deed to a cottage that had waited 79 years to matter. Her mother's letter lay open, the last line visible in the fading light. "I trust your judgment. I always have."